Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Ask With Forum. I'm Kurt Fisher. I'm the Bigelow Professor of Education and Human Development here. I'm one of a group of us who are trying to bring children's work with children together into a fruitful collaboration through the Children's Initiative, an interfaculty initiative at Harvard, which also works with people from around the Boston area who are interested in that. One of the major working groups within the initiative is the one called Children and the Prevention of Violence, which I'm coordinating. Our speaker today, Betsy McAlister Groves, is a member of that group, I'm happy to say. And we're a new group. We're not quite sure what we're doing, but we're figuring that out. We're trying to bring together the many people who are doing wonderful work on preventing violence and understanding the consequences of violence and the causes of violence in order to try to be more effective in both understanding and intervention. Betsy Groves' work is right in the middle of this, of course. Violence doesn't affect children only through their being violent or having violence committed against them, but also through their experiencing violence by witnessing it. Betsy founded the Child Witness to Violence Project at the Boston Medical Center and has now completed this great new book, Children Who See Too Much, Lessons from the Child Witness to Violence Project. Now, most of us, I think, already knew that how important it was to understand violence, but before September 11th, maybe it was possible for some of us to have the illusion that we were in a world where at least our part of it wasn't affected too much by violence. It's never been true. After 9/11, we really know it's not true. So the centrality of this work is even more evident than it was back last summer. Betsy's going to talk to us today then about what she says in the book and some other things as well, and we're going to learn about her findings and her interventions to prevent long-term damage from witnesses to violence. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Kurt. I actually want to begin by thanking all of you for coming. For me, this is a special celebration because it's actually the first lecture that I have given specifically about the book, and it seems particularly fitting to do it here because this institution, specifically the Harvard Children's Initiative and the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy at the Kennedy School, gave me a home for the year to write the book. So there are special people in the audience from those places, my family, my friends, colleagues of mine from the hospital, staff from the Child Witness to Violence Project, and I want to thank you all. I also want to thank Dottie Engler for organizing this and to particularly acknowledge Kurt's graciousness and that of the Violence Working Group who agreed to change. This group is actually supposed to meet tonight, and they agreed to switch the date, so I'm appreciative of that. I must also admit to a certain amount of trepidation. I've done a lot of speaking over the years that I've worked with the project, but there's something about being here and talking about my book that makes me nervous. And I'm reminded of an exchange that I had with our younger daughter, Rebecca, some years ago. Since she's not here tonight, I can talk about her. But it went like this. I was scheduled to give a talk at the hospital at Pediatric Grand Rounds, which occurs at 8 o'clock, from 8 to 9 on a weekday morning. And so I was leaving the house early to do that, and I was dressed up a little more formally than I usually do to go to work. So I went in to wake Rebecca up to let her know, and she was fast asleep, and she kind of rolled over and looked at me, and she said, "Where are you going?" And so I told her that I had to leave early because I was giving a talk. And she paused for a minute, and she said, "Mom, why would anyone want to hear you at 8 o'clock in the morning?" And I thought, well, that's actually a good question. Why would anyone want to hear me at any hour of the day? She wasn't being fresh about it. She was just curious that this was really a kind of curious occurrence. So as I look out and see many of you who are leaders in this field, I confess to a moment of self-doubt about what I have to say. However, that being acknowledged, I want to tell you about the history of this book and also something about our work at the Child Witness to Violence Project. In 1999, I received a fellowship from the Open Society Institute, one of the many grant-making projects funded by George Soros. And this fellowship was to write about my experiences at the Child Witness to Violence Project, a mental health program that's located at Boston Medical Center in the Department of Pediatrics for young children and their families who are exposed to significant violence. I had long wanted to write about what I had learned from the many children that we had seen in our project over the then 8 years of its existence. I believe that we had learned some amazing things, and I wanted to bring the voice of children to a wider audience so that their perspectives of the impact of violence could be heard. I also wanted to talk about what we have learned that is helpful to children, how adults can listen to and help children heal from the scars, if you will, that are associated with being exposed to violence. So the product of my fellowship is this book titled Children Who See Too Much, Lessons from the Child Witness to Violence Project. Now, this book went to press on August 26th of this past year, 16 days before September 11th. In the dazed, frantic, and traumatized aftermath of that day, the publishers, Beacon Press, contacted me and asked if I could add a foreword to the book. It was too late in the production process to alter the book in any other way. So I wrote the following. This book went to press in late August of 2001. On September 11th, the nation's basic conceptions of safety and security were forever changed as we helplessly watched a series of attacks on New York City and Washington, D.C. that have, as of this date, and this was actually written on October 11th, have left nearly 5,000 people dead, obliterated 14 acres of New York City, resulted in the loss of thousands of jobs, and have left countless heroic helpers numb with trauma. We are collectively terrified. We don't know what will happen next. We don't know who or what the enemy is. We look suspiciously at strangers. We stock up on antibiotics to protect ourselves against the invisible. In Chapter 2 of this book, I describe in some detail how exposure to violence transforms children's view of the world and changes their basic ability to trust that they can be safe. I make the point that one does not have to be a direct victim of violence to experience this fundamental change in outlook on the world. Experts who write about children and trauma describe that children develop pervasive pessimism or a sense of foreshortened future, and that this sense of doom stays with them for a long time. It strikes me that these terms are currently applicable to all of us. The notion of children seeing too much has become the reality of a country seeing too much and enduring too much loss. This reality we now share with millions in a world too often overwhelmed by violence. We as adults can get our minds, perhaps, around community violence or domestic violence, and we can think of ways to help children. But can we even know how to talk about this national horror? How can we help children if we are paralyzed with our realization of the fragility of life and peace? The Child Witness to Violence Project, along with mental health agencies throughout the country, has received many calls for assistance. Our calls have largely focused on questions about how to talk to children and how to help children feel less scared. Parents have told us that their children are afraid to go to school and don't want their parents to go to work. One child worried that his school was on the 3rd floor of a building. To this child, the building was like a skyscraper. A kindergarten teacher in New York City said that her children wouldn't lie down at rest time without their shoes on because they were so afraid that they would have to flee the building. One child, whose father flies frequently for business, drew a picture of her father as Superman and gave it to him as he left for work. She made no comment about the picture, but her wish was apparent. Older children wondered why others hated this country so much or whether we were going to war. In response to the many requests for information, we developed guidelines for parents of young children to give them support in talking with their children. And these guidelines are included as an addendum to the book. But even as we put the words on paper, we struggled with the large questions. How do we understand such evil in the world? Why would anyone hate a country enough to unleash such terror? How can buildings the size and the strength of the World Trade Center be totally destroyed? In the continuing atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, can anyone feel safe? These are the hard questions that we now live with. And so this foreword goes on for a few more paragraphs. Now, in early November, after Rough Galleys had been sent to several reviewers, the first review of note appeared from Publishers Weekly. And it was not a great review. I probably shouldn't say that here because I'm supposed to be selling books. But actually, it was just an odd review. And let me read you two pieces of this. So it starts off by saying, the need for a book to help parents and caregivers whose children have seen violence has never been more apparent than in the days following the September 11th terrorist attack on the United States. While Boston Medical Center's 10-year-old Child Witness to Violence project is specifically designed to do just that, this book by the project's founder, a licensed social worker, disappoints. So then it goes on. And then at the end of the review, it says, at press time, Beacon did not have plans to accelerate the publication of this book. And in fact, that was on the table for discussion briefly. And Beacon and we decided not to do that. So while many parents and educators could benefit from Groves' advice right now, they may have to wait until February. But by then, the shelves will probably be packed with related titles, thus stunting this one's potential. So what the reviewers seemed to be saying was, the book really isn't going to tell you anything useful about how to help children with the events of September 11th. Of course, the book wasn't about September 11th. And then simultaneously it says, why isn't this book out now when we need it? So after puzzling over this fact for a while, and I must admit I was heartbroken over this review, I came to the conclusion that the reviewer was mirroring what we all were feeling, a sense of helplessness, anger, a sense that there are no answers, but an almost irrational desire to find something that would make it better, that would just make the pain and the confusion go away. So here we are, 6 months later, almost to the day. The book is out. It has gotten subsequent reviews that are both more coherent and more positive than that one. And we're living in a new world. Or as Ralph Blumenthal of the New York Times put it, the people who are saving the paper from the day of the attack are really on the wrong track. The newspaper that everyone should save is the paper of September 11th, which is the last day of the old world. Everything is different now. This talk will be a brief attempt to take stock of where we are, what we have learned from our work in the Child Witness to Violence Project about how children are affected by violence in their lives and what we can do about it. Throughout, I will ask you to hold 4 basic principles in your thinking, and these, I think, are the main messages of the book. I hope they are anyway. The first principle is that age offers no particular immunity to the effects of violence in the environment. Children of all ages are affected. In fact, the youngest referral that we have gotten in our project was a 13-month-old girl who had witnessed her father assault her mother. And the mother called several days after this with a very clear description of symptoms that had occurred that were new subsequent to this assault. So she described this child's difficulty going to sleep, and the most striking and I think intense symptom that she talked about was the child's terror at being left alone. In fact, the mom said, I can't even go to the bathroom without my daughter crying, my baby screaming. So children of all ages are affected. And I think related to this is the fact that young children are generally more aware than we give them credit for. We as adults have a tendency to deny this, partly because we want to protect children from the awful realities of the world. One of the more, I think, spectacular examples of this denial on our part came from an article in Newsweek, and I actually quote it briefly in my book, and I'm going to read you a piece of it now. This was an article that appeared shortly after the 1995 bombing of Oklahoma City. And some of you may remember the infamous cover of that magazine with the picture of the fireman holding the baby. And I think it's one of those images that probably is embedded in our minds forever. So this was Newsweek's coverage of that event, and they had a section in there for guidance for parents. And I read this as my colleague and I were on the plane flying to Oklahoma City to work with preschool teachers, to do some training and support of preschool teachers. As many of you remember, there was a daycare center in the building. So we were headed out there, and we were poring over Newsweek. And what it said, this is the section, this is what it said about preschoolers. Turn off the TV and don't discuss the bombing. Small children are usually oblivious to death, but they can be upset when they realize that adults, especially parents, are distressed. Now, we certainly agree with the second half of that. But they were essentially saying that preschoolers, you shouldn't talk to preschoolers about it because they wouldn't know, they would have no awareness of it. We kind of scratched our heads as we read that because we had just come from our own daycare center at the hospital where kids were building blocks and having them all fall down, where at least 2 of the children knew that a daycare center had been bombed and they were worried that it might happen in our building. We heard countless other stories from parents of preschoolers. So, as I say, I think this is one of the more blatant examples of this denial or the tendency to wish that somehow age would protect children. Then a second principle that I focus on throughout the book is the fact that age and cognitive stage of development shapes a child's understanding of and response to violent events. So the response of a 2-year-old is, of course, quite different from a 7-year-old, and that is quite different from an 11 or a 12-year-old, and that the meaning that children make of these events is different. I think that also obviously has implications about how we help children understand and deal with these events. Then a third principle is that domestic violence, and I define that as violence between adults in the home, carries a particular and intense threat for children's emotional development. We're sometimes asked, and I'm going to tell you more about our project, but we see many children who have witnessed many different kinds of violence. And we're sometimes asked if we can comment on what kinds of violence seem to be more psychologically harmful for children. And of course, a question like that, it's tempting to answer in broad generalities, so I will put that I guess, disclaimer out. But in general, we have found that exposure to domestic violence is much more toxic for children, and it makes sense when you think about it. And by that I mean that the symptoms are more intense and they are longer lasting. And the way that we understand that, of course, is that children, particularly young children, depend on their adult caregivers for protection and for emotional sustenance or comforting. But if you have one parent who's the terrified victim of violence and the other who's the perpetrator, the child has no refuge. So in that way, domestic violence, we think, becomes so much more harmful for children. We also think if we are going to look at the big issue or the big question of violence prevention, and I mean particularly preventing helping children to avoid using violence or aggression as a way to cope with lives or problems or relationships, then we have to take on domestic violence, because for many children, the earliest lessons they learn about violence, they learn from within the home. And I think in many ways they're the most powerful lessons. So domestic violence has come to be a very central part of the work that we do. Then a fourth principle is that parents and the caregiving environment mediate a child's experience of the outside world, and they shape in a very powerful way a child's perceptions of events in the larger world. And I think that this then, and I'll say more about this later, but this then speaks to the enormous power or capacity that we all have as adults to help children make sense out of the world. So, what does the research literature tell us about children's response to traumatic events? Obviously, there have been many, many, many books and papers written about this, and I'll just say a very few things about it. One thing that I think is interesting is that this is actually a rather new field. As recently as the mid-'80s, there was still debate in the child psychiatry community about whether children, particularly a young child, could be, or how a young child could be affected by events in the external environment. There was a great deal of interest in adult response to trauma, and as many of you know, the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder first appeared in the mental health nomenclature, I think in the late 70s, or maybe 1980. But it was believed that children could not suffer from PTSD or could not qualify to be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, that somehow their responses were different, that they were more transitory and fleeting, and therefore couldn't qualify for the diagnosis. We now know differently, of course. There have been numerous studies done on children's responses to a range of traumatic events. And actually, for a talk that I did recently, I was asked to just look at the literature, and it's just amazing. I'll give you just a brief list of the kinds of traumas that have been studied in terms of looking at children's response. Researchers have looked at natural disasters, one of the earliest being a flood in West Virginia, the Buffalo Creek Dam collapse. I think it was written about in the early 70s. There's been look at hurricanes, Hurricane Hugo, Hurricane Andrew, earthquakes, a range of human-made disasters or trauma, school shootings, airplane crashes, certainly war, political violence, terrorism. There are studies of children's responses to the Challenger disaster, the space shuttle. Of course, there are studies of children's responses to the Oklahoma City bombing, to the Polly Klaas kidnapping, and the list goes on and on. And I'm sure that we will see a great deal of research coming out of the events of September 11th. And what these studies have shown us is that children's reactions are strikingly similar to adults' reactions. And that for events that are more real or more present in children's lives, that this kind of exposure changes some of the fundamental ways that children view their world and their safety. So let me tell you about the Child Witness to Violence Project. It began in 1992. And it grew out of work in a daycare center that is located on the premises of the hospital, and out of the work that was done in the pediatrics department at the hospital. This hospital, by the way, was Boston City Hospital at the time. I'm one of those, you can't teach old dogs new tricks, and I still call it Boston City Hospital. It's now Boston Medical Center. So this was the early 90s, and what we were increasingly aware of is hearing stories from children who were either seen in the pediatric clinics or who, in my case, were seen in a daycare center on the premise of the hospital. Stories about violence that children saw in their environment. And if you remember, in the early 90s, Boston saw its highest homicide rate ever. I mean, Boston and many urban areas. And the newspapers were full of stories about community violence, gang-related violence, drug violence. And what we were hearing from children was their observations or their awareness of this. So these were kids in my center between the ages of 3 and 5, and they would come in and talk about hearing gunshots at night. I remember one parent telling us a story about her strategy to keep her children safe, which was to put them in the bathtub when shooting or fighting broke out in her neighborhood. We had many parents. And I remember my pediatric colleagues telling me about parents who would say they couldn't allow their children to go out and play because it wasn't safe. And they talked about their anguish and their frustration and sometimes the tensions that arose in households because some kids literally couldn't go out and play. Could I ask someone to turn on the slide projector? I think I shut it off. I actually have a few slides. Okay, let's see here. So this is a cover of the Atlantic Monthly. I think, this was in 1990. That, I think, really exemplifies some of what we were worried about and thinking about at that time. So we had a kind of cumulative concern about what this did to children's development. And I'll tell you a brief story of what particularly crystallized this for me. The center that I worked in took care of 20 children who were from high-risk neighborhoods in Boston. And one day when we provided transportation to the children to and from the center. And one day as the van was making its way from the Family Development Center out into the neighborhoods of Boston, it was forced to stop suddenly because a shooting had erupted. And what happened was, I'm sorry, it was not a shooting, it was a knifing, a stabbing. What happened, as the bus driver and the adult monitor later told us, was that a man came running in front of the van, being pursued by another man who was wielding a knife. And the victim, who was bleeding profusely, collapsed in front of the van. So the van had to stop. And we had a situation that could not possibly have been anticipated by any of the adult caregivers, but we had a situation where about 10 kids on this van saw this. So the van was stopped for several minutes. Apparently the EMTs arrived and the police, and they removed the victim, and the van went on its way to finish dropping off kids. The teacher came back to the center, and we were actually having a staff meeting at the time. And I remember this vividly. I'd only been there about 4 or 5 months, I think. And she talked about what happened, and she was very upset, as you might imagine. And we began to talk as a group about how these children would make sense out of this event. These were children 3 to 5. What does a 3-year-old know about a stabbing? How does a 4-year-old think about this? And what life experience or what exposures might inform their understanding of this? And I was the mental health consultant to the team. As you might expect, they all looked to me to answer the questions, and I didn't know the answers to the question. I had no idea. And I remember thinking at the time that my own children, actually one of whom is here tonight, were just a little bit older than those kids, and I began to think myself, how would they make sense out of this if they saw this event? So we had a lively discussion about this, and we decided that we would wait. We were trying to think about what would be the best response for the children when they came in the next day. So we decided that we would wait and listen and observe for cues that the children might give about their understanding of this event or some reference to this event. So with that game plan, the children came in the next day, and we waited, and the teachers observed, and I was kind of floating in and out of classrooms, and we waited all morning, and there was no reference that we saw to what they had seen the day before. So the lead teacher, who's a wonderful provider, decided that we should have circle time and talk about it, that the teachers would bring it up. So they did this. They said, do you remember what happened on the van yesterday? And all of a sudden, the kids began to talk about it, and they had many questions about it. They asked questions. I mean, it's interesting because I think that the questions that they asked, we have since come to see as very enduring themes in children who witness traumatic events. So there were kind of 2 sets of questions. One set of questions was about what happens to the human body when it's injured. I mean, what does a 4-year-old really understand about blood or injury? So they asked questions about how much blood is in the body. We're in a hospital, so they wanted to know, did the man come to our hospital? Did the doctors sew him up? And I remember at least one child had actually had stitches for some injury. So there was this kind of digression about what it meant to sew up. What kind of thread was used, and what about the needle? So there were questions about what happens to the body, and about, I think, basically this notion of integrity of human body. Then the second set of questions was about why it happened. And it perfectly reflected, I think, preschoolers' somewhat concrete understanding of right and wrong, which is that this kind of notion that might makes right. So the preschooler's assumption was he must have done something wrong. And so they tossed that around for a while, but the other thing that emerged very quickly was their fear that they were somehow vulnerable to. And I think this really got centered into in a lot of discussion about police making arrests and about did the man go to jail. And one little girl piped up and said she'd seen a story on television about somebody breaking out of jail. So then there was a discussion about, breaking out of jail. I think the real message being, are we safe? Can we be safe again? So I think I will never forget that story. And as I say, I think that those themes we've heard over and over again. I also think that it gave us one of the real guiding principles for our project, which is simply that we need to give children permission to talk about these events. That I think in retrospect, we were engaged in a kind of conspiracy of silence with the children, that no one was going to talk about it. And when we said, it's okay, we can talk about this, then they began to talk. So we had this experience in the child care center. And the next thing we wanted to do is we were curious about how much violence or how many children are exposed to violence. Now, we were beginning to focus specifically on this notion of children being bystanders to violence. We know that children, too many children, are direct victims of violence. But we knew less about this group of kids who didn't have physical symptoms or injuries, but who we increasingly believed were profoundly affected psychologically. So we wanted to try to look at that group of children. So what we did, and my then division director and now chief of pediatrics, Barry Zuckerman, organized a study in the emergency department of the hospital. And I will just show you the results of this. This actually wasn't a very sophisticated study at all, but we put together an interview instrument. And we interviewed parents who were seeking outpatient pediatric services at what was then Boston City Hospital about their children's exposure to violence. We looked at parents of children aged 6 or under, and we asked a fairly straightforward set of questions. Has your child witnessed a violent event, to your knowledge, in the past year? If so, who was the victim? Who was the perpetrator? How many violent acts? Let's see, what else did we ask? We asked questions about, did it change your parenting strategies or your parenting practice? Can you discuss that? Can you tell us about that? And then we asked a question about women's histories of being victims of violence. So what we found, so 115 mothers were interviewed. We found that 1 in 10 children in this sample had witnessed a knifing or a shooting before the age of 6. And we were absolutely stunned by that. The average age of the child was 2.7 years. We found that an additional 18% had witnessed what we defined as moderate violence. Shooting or knifing or shooting we defined as severe violence. Moderate violence being defined as pushing, hitting, kicking, or shoving. So an additional 18% had witnessed that kind of violence. Half of the reported violence occurred in the home and half on the streets, and that surprised us because we assumed we had to give a kind of informed consent to parents before doing this interview, essentially saying that if we heard information that would give us reason to suspect that a child was at risk or in danger, then we were legally mandated to report to the Department of Social Services. So even with that disclaimer and the fact that this happened in the waiting room, these were not private interviews, we still had a very high rate of reporting, essentially, of domestic violence. And then finally, we found that 1 in 5 mothers were victims of violence. So I think that this really gave us the data to begin to say in a more urgent way, we need to do something about this. And we essentially talked about different strategies, decided to create a program that focused specifically on young children who were bystanders to violence, and to do 2 things. One is to offer clinical mental health counseling services to these children, but also to do outreach to community providers who work with these children, and in some way, and we were vague about that in the beginning, partner with them to increase our efforts to help these children stabilize and be able to live more productive lives. So the project was funded by a small grant from the Medical Foundation of Boston. As any of you in this audience know who write grants, you know the ways that you can kind of put programs into certain frameworks or contortions, basically, to fit the requirements of the funder. This particular foundation is a wonderful foundation, but they fund hospital-based services that promote convalescence in children. This is fairly broad. So we pitched this as convalescence from trauma, and they bought it. So we had, as I say, we had a modest amount of funding. It supported part of my time, allowed us to hire another clinical social worker, and the program began. Now, from the beginning, we've had the 2 major goals for the program that I just mentioned: the provision of counseling clinical intervention to help children heal from the effects of exposure to violence, and the mission to enhance the capacity of community caregivers to respond to and support children. So we opened our doors in 1992. I will not forget our first client, and actually because of time, I was going to read you an excerpt from the book about my work with our first client, who was a 4-year-old boy who had witnessed the murder of his mother. This was actually the first homicide, I think, of 1992. But I write about that at some length in the book. And what I say about it essentially was how difficult it was for me to do that work, to really face the unbearable series of thoughts about what it must be like for this little boy, but also how much this little boy taught me about both about talking about it, but also I think about how environments can help kids. So we began to take referrals, fortunately with few with stories as horrifying as that. But we saw children who'd witnessed violence in their neighborhoods, on the streets, and in their homes. Now, 10 years later, our program has grown to a staff of 7 persons. Last year, we received over 150 referrals for service. The referrals come from a wide range of people and agencies: schools, health care facilities, courts, battered women's shelters, the Department of Social Services, mental health agencies, and self-referrals, and police, I should say. Our funding, which obviously has also grown, comes primarily from state and federal criminal justice monies. And I want to say something about this because it remains interesting to me that it has been easier for us to get criminal justice money, essentially, than to get mental health money. It was hard for us to get mental health money for this project. And I think that partly has to do with basically the leadership of both Janet Reno at a national level and in this state Scott Harshbarger at a state level, both of whom I think clearly said that we need to link crime prevention to early intervention with children, that if we can intervene early, this is also a form of crime prevention. So we were able to get funding through them. In fact, the Massachusetts Attorney General's office funded our initial linkage with the Boston Police Department. And I just want to say a few things about that, because our first outreach to this group of community collaborators was the Boston Police Department, and we wrote that into our first grant. And what we said about it at the time is that we were puzzling about how we could find these children. Again, because they don't have injuries, they wouldn't come to the emergency department of our hospital for having witnessed violence. But we thought early on, you know, the police see these kids all the time. They're the first on the scene of violent events, and they see kids. So could we somehow make some kind of relationship with the police so that we could get referrals from them? And I can remember going to my first meeting at the Boston Police Department headquarters. Now, I'd been a social worker for a good 25 years at the time. I could count on the fingers of one hand the number of times I had ever talked to a police officer in the course of my work. It was just kind of like parallel universes. We didn't have much to do with them, and they didn't have much to do with us. So we went to this meeting. We put out this idea. I thought, they're not going to like this. This is kind of soft social worky stuff, and, you know, they're going to just sneer. But I was completely wrong. They welcomed us with open arms, and they began to talk about cases. And these were very seasoned, experienced officers who now had positions of authority in the department, and they began to talk about early cases that they had been on involving children. And it was quite remarkable to me, because almost to a person, they could tell stories that had stayed with them for years and years about responding to calls, seeing children, and then feeling so helpless because they knew how to stabilize the situation, but they didn't know what to do with children, and they said that. So they said, we'd be delighted to work with you. So we initially set up this referral mechanism where they would see families and make referrals to us, but what began to happen was that we liked working together, and the police were interested in finding out more. So we worked particularly with a very innovative, creative captain in Dorchester, Captain Robert Dunford. He's been there for the same 10 years that I've been at the hospital. And he came to us and said, do you think that we could do some training of police officers on how to talk to children or how to recognize children's needs? And we were intrigued with that, and we said, yeah, let's try it. So what we did, and I'm making a long story short, but we essentially put together a seminar series, 9 sessions, where we brought a group of police officers to the hospital, and we organized a series of kind of interactive lectures and cases around basic principles of child development. So we talked about moral development in children. We talked about kind of cognitive development and children's changing perceptions. And actually what we did is we videotaped children talking about police officers. So what does a 4-year-old say about a police officer? It's great. I mean, they say, well, they arrest people. They throw them in jail. We have this one tape where we ask a 4-year-old, how do you know police are arresting people? And, with the utter certainty that 4-year-olds speak, he said, because their lights are on. So for this child, anytime he saw a police light on, they were taking someone to jail. So then we have children of different ages talking about what police officers do. So we use that as a way to talk about cognitive development. We talk about trauma in children. We talk about interviewing children. We talk about resilience in children. And I'm delighted to say that Rick Weisbord, who's in the audience, has been our regularly featured lecturer on resilience in children for a good 6 years now, and the police officers love it. So we have done this seminar now for 8 years. It's been a remarkable experience. It's one of my personal favorite aspects of the work. And I think what we've learned, in essence, was that first of all, that police are astute observers of human behavior. Their very lives depend on it many times. And that many of them go into the work for basically the same reasons that many social workers go into the work, because they want to help families. Now, I think our understanding or our roles around helping families are different, but there's an enormous common ground. And further, that they feel unappreciated and that they don't like it when children are scared of police officers. So we've done this for many years. We've evaluated this training. We've gotten very good feedback from police officers. And I think that we have, in a small way, begun to get these parallel universes more on a similar universe. And I think this was best summed up by a statement we've presented this at several conferences, and we were actually at a conference in Washington, and I was presenting with one of the police officers who now co-teaches the course with me, and he was trying to make a point about how together we are in our views of the world, and he thought for a minute, and he said, I just came to the realization that it's like we're social workers with guns on. And I thought, wow, now there's an image for you. I'm not sure I wanted to go there, but I just love that. So we've done, I say that as one example of the kinds of community collaborations. We've done similar work with teachers, with court officials, in an attempt to really reach out to all of the many of the other professionals whose work touches the lives of children. So as we began to see children and their families, certain themes emerged that were echoed over and over and over again. And I want to mention these to you. And I'm going to do so by showing you some pictures that children have drawn in our project. Those of you who've heard me speak before know that I never give a talk without showing pictures, because I think that pictures speak more clearly than words do at times. And one of the ways that we help children talk about or share with us what has happened is by offering them different ways of communicating. So our offices have carefully selected toys. We have doll houses, puppets. Among my personal favorites are a shark with large teeth, a big butterfly and 4 little butterflies, a dog, a doctor's kit, rescue vehicles, a police car, an ambulance, drawing materials, and so forth. So children who cannot talk about these scary things may be able to draw a picture or use puppets. And from all of these expressions have emerged consistent themes. And I just remembered, I put a slide in here. I have to tell you one more story about the police work. One of the things that the creative officers in C11 did was we were talking about this whole notion about how children can have more benign contact with police officers. Because children, certainly some of the children we saw at the hospital, their contacts with police officers were anything but benign. They were highly charged, frequently having to do with the removal of a parent or some very scary event. So the officers at C11 came up with what I thought was an incredibly brilliant idea, which is to have baseball cards printed, which they call cop cards. And this is an example of a cop card. So every officer in C11 had his or her own cop card. And on the back of the cop card were certain personal facts about the police officer, again, designed to humanize the officer. So things like favorite sport, favorite flavor of ice cream, things like that. And they would have a day of the week. So on some given day of the week, police officer Thomas Limbo, it would be his day, and the children could come to the station and get a signed card. And it was brilliant because it really fostered this kind of low-key, non-emotionally charged interaction with police officers. Kids loved it. They collected the cards. I had a whole set of cards. I ringed my bulletin board in my office with them for several years. So I wanted you to see a cop card. So let me tell you briefly about some of the themes. One of the themes, and I've referred to this earlier, is this notion that if you have been a bystander to violence, if you've seen violence, the world, particularly for children, you come to, you lose a sense that the world is a safe or predictable place. And this has all kinds of implications for how children function in personal relationships and social interactions and in learning. So we have this picture drawn by a 5-year-old boy of his house, and this is a child who lived actually both with domestic and community violence. And he draws his house as a monster. As he told the story about it, he said the door has teeth and the windows have eyes, and he described that there was hot oil coming from the chimney. The circular window under the peaks of the roof have thorns around them. So there's nothing about this house that is safe or comfortable. And he draws himself and actually his sister running away from the house. So we've heard versions of this many, many times from children. This is a self-portrait of a little boy who talked about his fear. And he talked about getting up in the morning and feeling afraid as soon as he stepped out of bed. And so this is his portrait. You see the alarm clock there, and he has his pajamas on, but his hands are outstretched, and he's screaming. Then I think we have the whole host of fears that are associated with the notion that if it happens once, it can happen again. And if I can't cognitively make sense out of why it happened, then I'm always going to worry that it happens again. And so we have lots of variations of this theme. This, as I think you can tell, this was a picture drawn after September 11th by one of the kids in the daycare center at the hospital, as he talked about his fear that it was going to happen again. Another theme we've heard over and over again is this notion that my parents aren't safe, and if they're not safe, then they can't protect me. So this sense of vulnerability. And this is drawn, this actually was drawn by a little girl who gave a very literal account of domestic violence that she had witnessed. And what she told about it, she drew the bottom half of the picture first. And she draws herself and her mother in bed together. They're sleeping. When the father, who had a protective order that prohibited him from being on the premises, violated that order and came to try to get into the house, couldn't do it, broke into the house, broke the door down and punched mother in the face. And this is what she's drawn at the top half of the picture. So you have the mother now, a very small, vulnerable figure with blood, and the child with her arms outstretched. And I think what's striking is this sense of, first, the vulnerability of the mother. But secondly, I think the juxtaposition, I mean, this notion of safety and proximity, being with one's mom in the bed, against what was so horrifying for this child to see her father hit her mother. And then we have this picture, and I actually referenced that briefly in the foreword of the book. This is the picture that the little girl drew of Superman, which she gave to her father after September 11th, when her father began to fly again. Her father flew frequently for business. And as I said before, she didn't say anything about it, but the father who works with us, I mean, it was just so clear. Superman can always fly, so if the planes get hit, her father will be okay. And then finally, that feelings of vulnerability lead to aggression. And I think that this begins to make the connection between violent and aggressive behavior and being the bystander to violence, particularly for young children, that if you feel overwhelmed and paralyzed and helpless, one choice about that is to be on the offensive, to strike before being struck. So we see many kids who are very, very aggressive and indiscriminately aggressive and kind of boiling over with fear and anger. And I think that this is the connection. And I think, you know, we have to wonder, at least in part, about this connection to kids who come to school armed or who are constantly provoking fights. So we've learned this, but I also want to say that we've learned about what helps children, and I want to say a few things about that before I conclude. Essentially, and I'm boiling this down a lot, but essentially, help for children, we believe, is rooted in relationships that offer safety, predictability, and stability. That if we can offer children an environment that is safe, and I mean school environments or therapeutic environments, then I think that we help children unlearn basically some of these lessons. So we look to environment, we look to relationship, we talk to teachers about their capacities to create environments that are helpful and healing for children, about their capacities to establish trusting relationships with kids. We have heard countless stories from teachers about what kids will share once they know and trust and love a teacher. And we ask children what will help. So we have children who say things. Two of my favorite quotes from children, we actually have it on videotape. A little boy who says counseling helps. And we said, well, how does it help? And he said, in this case, he was seeing a school counselor. And he said, well, it's like the counselor takes the thoughts out of my head. This is an 8-year-old boy. And I thought, that's such an interesting way to say it. It sounds like a tooth extraction or something. And I don't think the counselor would describe her work necessarily with the action verb of taking thoughts out of one's head. But I think for this boy, what he experienced was this letting go of ideas and thoughts that were so scary for him. And so they didn't just belong to him anymore. The counselor also had them. And then we have another little segment of a videotape where a little boy talks about drawing, and he's asked by his therapist, does drawing help? And he said yes, and he thought about it for a minute, and he said it's like the feelings are on the tip of the marker, and they just come out. So I think, again, you have this sense of what it's like to be able to let go of some of this. We also ask children to draw pictures, because we want kids to identify areas of safety in their environment. So we ask this all the time. And I'll just show you a couple of these. This is one of my personal favorites. This is a little girl. I don't know what the antennae are exactly, but she talked about what helped her feel safe was a policeman. And this is actually a particular policeman that she knows, that Rick and I know too. This is Paul Johnston, who's actually one of the co-facilitators of the seminar now. And she'd had a visit from Paul Johnston, and so she drew this picture. And then this picture that I think really looks at the larger environment and ways that children can identify safety and support. So this child was asked to draw what helped him feel safe. And he drew a picture of his school, and it's probably hard to see, but this says my school and church. This is St. Mark's. This is actually St. Mark's School in Dorchester. He draws a police officer, and that's the big figure that looks a little bit like a ghost, but that's a police officer. And then a picture that says teacher, mom, and Nana. So that's his world. That's what helps keep him safe. So in closing, let me just think briefly or put out some ideas about where we are now 10 years later after the beginning of this project. First of all, as you know, violent crime rate has dropped throughout the country. We know that we've seen a sobering upsurge this year, but it's still down considerably from the early 90s. So there's less crime, and this is great. But I think what's sobering about this is that domestic violence crime has not dropped significantly. In fact, if you look at numbers of calls at District C11, the district where we've done the most work in Dorchester, last year there were about 2,500 calls for domestic violence. Dorchester District Court issued 1,800 restraining orders last year. So there are, I think, stunningly large numbers of episodes of domestic violence that warrant police calls. But I think on the positive ledger that there is an increased awareness of domestic violence. Domestic violence is much more public now than it was 10 years ago. There is less stigma associated with seeking help. One of the small gratifying statistics that we talk about in our program is that 25% of our referrals now are self-referred, and they are largely from women whose children have witnessed domestic violence. And we didn't get those in the early 90s. So I think it's more socially acceptable to identify oneself as being a victim and to seek help. This has led to changes in the law, at least in the area of domestic violence, both by case law and legislative change. We now have laws that help courts take a stronger stance on custody and visitation when a batterer is involved. Essentially, and I'm talking about the presumptive custody law, which was passed in 1998, which says that parents who perpetrate a pattern or serious incident of abuse may not get custody of their children unless the court can prove that there's some circumstances that would warrant that. So it tips the scales a bit. Research on early brain development, which has proliferated in the last decade, has helped us understand in a new way about the importance of early experiences for young children. It's also, I think, taught us about the risks associated with trauma or violence in very young children. And finally, that we're all living with new definitions of witness to violence. There have been school shootings, there's been Oklahoma City, and of course now there's September 11th. So it's a new landscape for us all, and I think a new sense of collective vulnerability. So in conclusion, I would simply want to remind us all that we do have a tremendous capacity to mediate the world for children. Our reactions and our responses shape our children's reactions and responses. So to the parents who ask us how to talk to children about the World Trade Center or the war, we first ask, how do you feel about it? How is it affecting you? Because the way you feel about it and the way you think about it is a key ingredient to how your child will think and feel about it. I would also challenge you to advocate vigorously for support for young families. Early intervention is prevention, I think, and we don't have enough of that for young families in this country, particularly for vulnerable families. We need to mobilize more support, more generous family leave policies, adequate health insurance, more high-quality and accessible child care, just to mention a few resources. And I think with that, given the time, I'm going to stop. Thank you very much. And there is, Dottie, we can take questions? Or yeah, okay. So thank you very much. Sure. Questions or comments or reflections? Yeah.
I realize this is probably branching out in another area, but the announcement mentioned television violence or video game violence. Have you done some research on that, and is there anything briefly that you can say about it?
Yeah, and I'm going to give a part answer to that question, but I'm going to ask Ron Slaby to address that too, because he has an enormous wealth of knowledge about this. And Ron can correct me if I'm wrong, but there have been literally thousands of studies that have looked at television violence, and probably hundreds by now that have looked at video violence. And in essence, I think that these studies show that violence on television is not good for children, that it is associated with higher rates of aggressive behavior, with kind of numbing or desensitization to other forms of violence. And they're mediating circumstances, and I think age is a variable that you want to think about carefully, that young children are more vulnerable to the effects of violence on television because they understand less about the world. But that there's too much media violence, and television is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, I think there are movies and what kids see on VCR and all of that. Ron, do you want to comment further about that?
It's interesting that you said we have the capacity to mediate the effects, and that's what the media is doing. I mean,
true.
So parents have a capacity to mediate the media, and we're looking now into investigation of building critical viewing skills on the part of kids to be able to distance themselves and to see through the falseness with which the media normally presents violence.
Yeah.
Because one one of the problems is not just that it presents violence, it's that it presents it in glorified ways.
That's right.
That are distorted, but yet make violence look very, heroic and manly and effective and rewarded and justified and pleasurable. And kids are susceptible to buying into at face value into those glorifications, and so therefore being even more powerfully affected than our adults.
Yeah. And I would say one other comment about this notion of parents mediating violence. I think one of the challenges that parents face now is also the inability to mediate violence. And I particularly think about examples such as the Challenger shuttle disaster, which Lenore Terra did this series of studies looking at children's reactions of this. And what she observed, of course, and what we know is that there were many children sitting in schools watching the television for a well-intended science lesson. And all of a sudden, it turned into this awful, horrible tragedy. And I think that parents, many parents, and probably many of us in this room, because we can't anticipate what's going to happen, there are limits as to how much we can mediate the world. And it's different. It's very different from 40 or 45 or 50 years ago when parents had a lot more control over access to news and outside events. Yeah, I think a number of schools are increasingly aware of the issues that you talk about and have introduced curriculum. I mean, I think about a widely used one, the Second Step curriculum, which is kind of conflict resolution, negotiation, nonviolence sort of curriculum. So I think there are growing numbers of schools that are attempting to address that issue through curricula or making available books, readings, discussion, that sort of thing. And that's a good thing.
I'm just going in another direction about what you currently know about infants' experience. You spoke about the 13-month-old, and I've read in detail, but I've heard that the brain is perhaps permanently impacted by early violence.
Yeah, the question is about what do we know about infants' reactions to or the effects of violence on or any kind of trauma or abuse on very young children, infants, and with the particular reference toward research that's looked at changes in brain development or brain chemistry as a result of exposure. I mean, again, it's a complex area, and I actually think I'm going to ask Kurt to comment on this one further because I know he knows a lot about this. But I think there is research that is sobering in showing the ways that even infants react to extreme trauma in the environment. But I think what's less clear is what that really means for intervention. As I understand it, one of the debates is, I mean, you could kind of take a worst-case scenario and say, it's all over by age 3. So you're saying there are these changes in the brain development, and so, it's a done deal. But I think that there's lots of evidence to the contrary, that there's an enormous amount of intervention, environmental, relationship-wise, that can mediate that exposure. And there actually is there's a book. The National Academy of Sciences did an enormous look at this topic and put out a report called From Neurons to Neighborhoods. I've forgotten what's on the other side of the colon. But it's essentially a huge review of the research that looks at these competing notions of effects of genetics and brain chemistry and environment. And do you want to say more about that, please?
I think what you said was actually great. In general, there's good evidence from animal studies that there are kind of separate learning mechanisms for traumatic learning, which are and hard to change. but that doesn't mean that they're just present in young organisms. They're present in adults as well. And as you said, people are remarkably adaptable and resilient under good circumstances. And we should not take it to mean that something that happens at an early age is sort of a done deal and can't be changed. Nothing like that at all.
Yep.
But it is true that traumatic learning happens quickly and is hard to erase.
Mm-hmm. And there is this new proposed classification of mental health disorders that in very young children, 0 to 3, and post-traumatic stress reaction, I think is what it's called, is in that diagnostic classification. So they are certainly looking at, even diagnostically, at post-traumatic stress sorts of things in very young children.
Question concerning the best academic treatment for elementary school and high school kids who have been exposed to severe domestic violence, and let's say in writing classes, social studies, does one help them or hurt them by eliciting tales of what they've seen or similar things, or is it best to avoid those topics, or does it depend on the particular?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question is about working with elementary or high school students who have grown up with domestic violence, for example, and what can academic settings do to help these kids? The particular question around writing, and should one encourage or discourage writing about personal events? I think several things. I think it, to some extent, depends on the child or the student. I also think that a teacher would not want to pressure a student into writing personal things. The issue is around who has control of that information, because I think so many of these kids feel as though they have control over very little of their lives. So to require or pressure a child to write or talk about difficult events, I think often isn't helpful. But by the same token, I think that giving children permission to do that, or students permission, can be enormously therapeutic. And we use some similar techniques in our work. I happen to be married to a teacher who's now a principal, who I know loves, has done a lot of work with writing and encouraging students to write, and he has shared with me some of his students' writing that is just remarkable, and I think is very healing and therapeutic to be able to do it. So I think as long as the student has control, essentially, of it, it can be a wonderful thing. Tim?
Just a short footnote.
Yeah.
I would say that it's very important for teachers not to get in over their heads.
Yeah, that's a good.
And to really use the resources within the school system and in the community to help them and not try to take over the role of a parent. So I think it's really important to look at it as a collaborative thing. The child trusts you enough to write. That's very important and very meaningful, but you really need to be careful and not try to think you're then all of a sudden able to play a role that you got.
Yeah. Hey.
Some of the questions imply that the child's witness to these traumatic and violent events happens once. Unfortunately, many kids are repeatedly exposed from a early age. And I wondered if you would say anything about that and about the relationship of long-term and constant exposure to resilience.
Yeah, so the question is about and I'm very glad you asked that, about chronic exposure. And you're right, I think, I guess two things come to mind. One is that I do sometimes lapse into this exposure to a single event, which is, all of you know who work with kids, it frequently is not a single event, more often than not. Also, I think that I am lifting exposure to violence out of a context that can contain many other risk factors, such as poverty, substance abuse, inadequate medical treatment, chronic health conditions. So I do want to acknowledge that really many of these families live with multiple stressors. And I think what we see is that for children who are exposed to chronic violence are much more vulnerable. It's harder to help them. It's harder to stabilize them. These are the kids who I think become very numb and desensitized, and who, may have a host of difficulties as they move into adolescence. And that generally, I think it's true for most people. People can bounce back from a single episode, but it's the kind of wearing down of episode after episode after episode that really starts to take a toll on children.
Say something about individual differences among children within the same family.
Yes. A question about individual differences among children in the same family. We actually have a wonderful video of a family that we've seen in our project that I use to describe that, and I'll just briefly tell you about it. There are 3 children who had witnessed a shooting, not a fatal shooting, but had witnessed a shooting, a boy and 2 girls. And we asked each of them, it was not a therapy session that we filmed, but we asked each of them to talk about what they had seen and to talk about how it made them feel. And through the series of interviews, they talk about how they cope with their fears, because they were terribly frightened by this. And what emerges is that they have 3 very different responses to the same event. And the example that I think is most striking is all the kids had trouble sleeping. They all had disrupted sleep. But the youngest child, a girl, figured out a way to help her to be safe, to feel safe at night. And what she does on the tape is she goes into this long and very amusing chronicle about how she lines up the stuffed animals around her bed. And she says, and I put the alligator here and the this here and my little doggy here, and she has them all lined up. But she can go to sleep. And then it's contrasted to her 11-year-old brother. So this is a child who's much older. He's a boy, the only boy in the family, which is significant. And he simply could not. He was so terrified, he couldn't figure out how to go to sleep at night. And what finally happened is he kicked the 5-year-old out of a bed in a joint bedroom so that he could sleep with his sister. And the 5-year-old went to her own room and did this stuffed animal routine. So you see children who seem to have more inner resources, who are, proactive isn't quite the right word, but they are initiative taking. They can create solutions. Children who have different styles of seeking help. So for instance, this little girl told lots of adults what was going on, so she got a lot of good support. The little boy didn't tell anyone. He just simply withdrew and shrank away. So I think that there are widely differing styles within the same family, and it's probably it's the same, the reasons are the same that for any of us who grew up in families or who have children, that they're different. There are differences in temperament and makeup and family relationships and all of that. Hi.
The story that you tell about the little boy who fell through this by kicking his sister out of the bed.
Yes.
Males often respond to the sense of powerlessness and witnessing powerful violence, not being able to stop the unacceptable from happening, by being dominant over others. And one can't but wonder why he displayed such controlling behavior in relationship to the sisters and some comfort for himself. So one has to be concerned in a situation like that. There are other issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, there were in this family other issues going on.
What are your suggestions for creating a safe school environment in a large urban public high school?
I wish I knew the answer to that. I mean, as you know, the question is, what are my suggestions for creating safety in large urban schools? There's a part of me that thinks I'm just not even sure how to respond to that. It's such a complex problem. And I think we could think about it at many different levels, all the way from, funding and the impoverishment that we are, I think, increasingly seeing in urban areas to, that's kind of the macro level, to the more micro level of supporting teachers, helping teachers really think about how to create environments within their classrooms that are nurturing and safe, and every level in between. I mean, in our project, we do work at that more micro level. We do work with teachers and try to help them both in terms of thinking about specific classroom organization, but I think at another level, really reaffirming their value as human beings who have relationships with kids, because I think teachers can be very discouraged. It's a hard time. So that's the level that we have chosen to work in. But it's a complicated and it's a very important question that I think a lot of people, I mean, certainly with the amount of violence, a lot of people are worrying about that a lot. Yes, Aileen.
Small comment, but just one of those last one. Tiny level. I love that story in the book where the policeman left a coin.
Yes.
And that was such a small level of his training of being exposed to the program. Was able to make him helpful within 2 minutes, you know, at a small level. But it's interesting.
Yeah, and I actually will say he was not, this happened many years ago. The story in the book is about a police officer who responds to a domestic violence calls and gives the boy a quarter, and it happens to be his birthday. And the little boy who grew up and actually is a colleague of mine talked about never having forgotten and actually keeping that quarter for years. And I used it as an example of a seemingly insignificant interaction that can make such a powerful difference in kids' lives. But it was amazing to talk to this now grown man about his memory of that. Yes, here. And I'll go. We would love to do that, and I think you really you raise a question if any of you are thinking about this. I think that one of the gaps or deficits in our program is that we have not done follow-up or a really systematic evaluation. We haven't had the resources, but we also haven't quite figured out how to do the evaluation. But it would be great, and we actually are using a Harvard undergraduate student who is going to spend the rest of this academic year doing selective follow-ups, just going to be kind of a random chart pull to simply call and see what's happening. So we're beginning, but we haven't done it yet.
I wanted to, in response to the question about classmates, I heard two wonderful teachers, Cambridge and Latin, who brought a kind of meditation, Buddhist perspective. Some people here might know who they are. They liken the classroom to a container. And as the youngsters come into the classroom, there's a period of meditation which allows them to cross over from the outside world to the world of the classroom, in which they have, a sort of set of values that allow that classroom to be a place where there's focus, and of course the meditation begins to provide that focus, respect, and real attention to the tasks at hand. And then at the end of the classroom, they have a kind of reflection on the classroom experience as they then prepare to re-enter the rest of the world. Does anybody know who those teachers, they're Cambridge? Do you remember who they were?
I just turned 61. I can't remember.
Well, so did I. I apologize, and I was.
Well, it's a wonderful example. I mean, that's just the kind of, teacher classroom level example that I think can make a huge difference. That's wonderful. Yeah.
I don't
Nancy.
know those teachers, but I know a lot of other people who are using approaches like that. Beacon published a book this year, School of the Spirit.
Yeah, that's right.
There are a lot of teachers in there. It's like a mindful classroom, and it comes right out. One of those teachers was a Buddhist monk for several years, and so it comes right out of that sort of sense of mindfulness, that you stop, you focus, and you make that transition from a world in which things happen and you don't have control and so on, to a world in which you can be mindful and focused and create your environment and find that sense of balance and peace within that environment. I was so impressed and I'm so embarrassed that I don't remember their name.
So it's a wonderful example. Dottie, is it about time? Are there any other questions? I guess I should say in closing that we do have copies of the book here. And thank you very much.
I really wanted to thank Betsy for coming. This is a topic of continued interest on our campus to Kurt throughout Harvard and throughout the country. It's so complicated. I think our association with Kurt has really brought a lot of us into the nuances and the importance of it. So I'm sure you'll see it on the forum program more frequently, and we welcome you back. And I just want to give a quick word. Talk of the Nation, for NPR Junkies, Talk of the Nation is going to be here next week with a live broadcast of a program on standards and testing. And there's information on the table about how to get reservations. The topic may not be quite up your alley, but Talk of the Nation may be. So if you'd like that information, please pick something up. Thank you for coming, and we hope to see you again.